I stood at the front door, flowers in one hand, a bottle of wine in the other, my heart full of excitement. Tonight, I was going to surprise Amelia with a romantic dinner, no special occasion, just to remind her of how much I loved her. The house was oddly quiet as I stepped inside. It was too early for her to be asleep, and I didn't hear the usual clatter of pots in the kitchen. I took a step forward, and that's when I heard it, a muffled laugh. A man's laugh, coming from upstairs. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it couldn't be what I thought. No, not Amelia, not my wife. I set the bottle down on the kitchen counter and moved toward the stairs, the soft sound of voices guiding me. Every step felt heavier than the last. My legs were moving, but my brain was fighting against it, trying to deny what I already knew deep down. The door to our bedroom was cracked open. I nudged it with my foot and froze at the sight inside. Amelia was lying on our bed, wrapped in the sheets, our sheets, with Jason. My friend Jason. His arm was draped over her bare back, and they were both smiling, whispering like high school sweethearts. That smile, the one she used to give me, was now meant for him. They didn't even notice me at first, too lost in their own world. I stood there, the flowers slipping from my fingers and landing softly on the floor. They finally looked up, their faces changing from pleasure to pure panic. Jason scrambled to cover himself, his eyes wide with horror. Amelia pulled the sheet closer around her, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to form words. "Neil, I can explain," she stammered, her voice shaking. I didn't say a word. I didn't scream. I didn't throw things. I just turned and walked out of the room. The quiet in my mind was deafening as I headed down the stairs and out the front door. I heard her call my name, but it was distant, as if I were already miles away. I wandered through the streets that night, my feet carrying me aimlessly while my mind raced. Every memory we'd shared, every promise she'd made to me flashed in my mind like a cruel slideshow. How long had this been going on? Was it just Jason, or had there been others? The questions buzzed around, but there was only one certainty. Amelia had betrayed me. And so had Jason. When the sun began to rise, I found myself standing in front of our house again. I wasn't ready to confront her, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't let them get away with this. They had shattered my life, and I was going to return the favor. If she thought she could just slip back into normalcy, she was wrong. If Jason thought this was going to be just a dirty secret between them, he was about to learn how wrong he was too. I wasn't going to destroy them with my fists. No, I was going to do something much worse. I was going to tear their world apart, piece by piece. I would make sure that everyone knew who they really were, and that everyone they cared about saw the truth. Jason wasn't just going to lose me as a friend. He was going to lose everything. I would burn it all down. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the cup of coffee in front of me. The house was quiet again, but this time it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that felt like it was weighing me down, like the walls were pressing in on me. I heard the soft creak of the floorboards as Amelia came downstairs. She walked into the kitchen, looking pale and exhausted, her eyes red from crying. "Neil, we need to talk," she said softly, as if trying not to break the silence too harshly. I didn't even look up. My hands were wrapped around the coffee mug, the warmth of it grounding me, keeping me from exploding. "I'm sorry," she continued, her voice trembling. "It was a mistake. I never meant for it to happen, Jason. It just happened. I was confused, but it doesn't mean I don't love you." My jaw clenched, but I kept my gaze fixed on the steam rising from the mug. "How long?" She blinked, caught off guard by the coldness in my voice. "What? How long has it been going on?" I asked again, this time meeting her eyes, my voice sharper. She hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "A few months," she whispered. "But it didn't mean anything." I laughed then, a bitter, humorless sound. "A few months of nothing? So you've been lying to me for months, sleeping with Jason, but it didn't mean anything?" I leaned back in my chair, the anger starting to seep into my veins again. "You think that makes it better? You think that makes you less guilty?" Her eyes filled with tears. I made a mistake. I wasn't thinking." I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You weren't thinking? You were thinking every time you lied to me, every time you met him behind my back, every time you came home and pretended everything was fine. Don't you dare tell me you weren't thinking." She flinched at my words, tears spilling down her cheeks now. But I didn't care. I wasn't interested in her tears, in her guilt. I wanted her to feel what I felt. I took a deep breath, trying to regain control of myself. "This isn't just between you and me anymore, Amelia. You've dragged Jason into this, and now he's going to pay for it too. You both will." Her face paled and her tears stopped for a moment. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I turned away from her, walking toward the window. The sky outside was gray, as if it matched the weight of everything crashing down around us. "I've already started. Last night I sent out invitations. Everyone's coming over this weekend, all of our friends. And I'm going to tell them everything." "Neil, no." she gasped, rushing toward me, her voice frantic now. "You can't. Please don't do this. It was a mistake, but we can fix this. We don't have to drag everyone into it." I turned to face her, feeling a surge of satisfaction as I watched the panic spread across her face. "No, we can't fix this, but I can sure as hell make sure that everyone knows exactly who you and Jason really are." Her face crumpled and she fell to her knees sobbing, "Please don't." But I was already gone. In my mind the plan was set. I would expose them both in front of everyone. Let our friends decide who they wanted to stand by. I knew exactly how it would go down. Amelia and Jason would lose everything. Their friends, their social circle, their sense of security. The same way I had lost everything when I walked into that bedroom. She stayed on the floor sobbing as I walked past her, out the front door, and into the cold gray morning. I knew she'd try to stop me. Maybe Jason would too. But it was too late. They had made their choices and now they would pay for them. I wasn't interested in reconciliation. I was interested in retribution. The rest of the week passed in a strange, eerie calm. Amelia stayed out of my way as if she understood that nothing she said or did now would change what was coming. I barely saw her. She spent most of her time upstairs avoiding me. I didn't care. The house felt like it was full of ghosts, our old life lingering in the air, taunting me, but I knew that would end soon. By Thursday, the messages started rolling in. People were confirming their attendance for the dinner party. No one suspected a thing. Why would they? To everyone else, we were still the perfect couple, and Jason was still my best friend. I made sure to include him in the group chat, just to twist the knife a little deeper. He replied like nothing was wrong, offering to bring wine. The arrogance of it made me laugh. Friday night, I sat on the couch, scrolling through old photos on my phone, pictures of me and Jason fishing, barbecue parties with all our friends, Amelia and I on our last vacation, smiling like nothing in the world could touch us. Each photo felt like a lie, and the more I looked, the angrier I got. But I kept going, feeding the fire inside me. I wanted to be ready for what was coming. I wanted to feel nothing but rage when I stood in front of them the next night. Around midnight, Amelia came downstairs. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were swollen, her hair a mess. She stood in the doorway hesitant. "Neil, please, let's talk. We don't have to do this. We can still work this out. We can." I cut her off with a cold glare. "There's nothing left to work out. You should be glad I'm even letting you stay in this house until tomorrow." Her face crumpled, but she didn't say anything else. She just turned and walked back upstairs, defeated. I didn't feel anything for her anymore. Not pity, not sorrow. Only the sharp edge of betrayal that had cut too deep to heal. Tomorrow, it would all be over. Saturday arrived, and I prepared the house for what would look like a regular dinner party. I set the table, poured drinks, and made sure everything looked perfect. I wanted the contrast, the illusion of normalcy, right before I tore everything apart. Amelia didn't help. She stayed locked in the bedroom until the doorbell rang. The first to arrive were Matt and his wife Lisa. They came in laughing, hugging me, completely unaware of what was about to happen. "It's been too long," Matt said, clapping me on the back. "Yeah, I've been looking forward to tonight," I said, forcing a smile. It felt strange, lying to them when I knew I was about to flip their world upside down. But it felt necessary. Soon the others trickled in, Kate and her husband, and a few more from our group. Finally, Jason showed up, a bottle of wine in hand, as if nothing had changed. He smiled at me with the same easy, confident grin he always had. "You really outdid yourself with the invite, man," he said, holding up the wine. "Thought we could use this tonight." I took the bottle, looking him dead in the eyes. "Yeah, I figured we'd all enjoy a night of truth." He didn't flinch. He didn't know what was coming. The evening started like any other. Small talk, laughter, drinks flowing freely. Amelia came down eventually, her face pale, her eyes red. She avoided looking at anyone, especially Jason, who kept glancing in her direction, a nervous tension building in the room that no one but the three of us seemed to notice. As dinner wrapped up, I knew it was time. I stood up and raised my glass. Everyone quieted down, turning their attention to me. Jason was still grinning, relaxed, completely clueless. Amelia sat frozen, her knuckles white as she gripped her chair. "To friendship," I said, my voice calm, steady. "To the kind of friends who stand by you through everything, no matter what. The ones who you can trust with your life." The group murmured in agreement, lifting their glasses. I saw Jason take a sip of his wine, completely unaware of the trap closing in. "But sometimes," I continued, my voice growing colder, "friendship isn't what it seems. Sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones who betray you. Sometimes your wife and your best friend lie to your face for months, sneaking around behind your back." The room went dead silent. All eyes were on me now, except for Jason's. He froze, the glass halfway to his lips. His face drained of color, and I saw the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. "What are you talking about, Neil?" Matt asked, looking confused. I turned my gaze to Jason. "Why don't you tell them, Jason? Why don't you tell all of our friends what you've been doing behind my back? Or maybe Amelia should explain? Jason stood up, his chair scraping loudly across the floor. Neil, this isn't the time. Oh, I think it's exactly the time, I said, my voice sharp. Let's not drag this out any longer. You and Amelia have been fucking each other for months, and I think our friends deserve to know the truth. A shocked gasp rippled through the room. Matt looked at me, then at Jason, as if trying to piece together what I had just said. Lisa's hand flew to her mouth in disbelief, while Kate's eyes darted between me and Amelia, who sat trembling in her seat. No, Jason said, his voice shaking. It's not like that, Neil. Don't lie to me again, I roared, my voice filling the room. I saw you. I caught you both right in my own house. You lied to me, to all of us. The room exploded in whispers, everyone talking at once, their voices full of shock and confusion. Jason stood frozen, his face pale, his eyes wide. Amelia looked down, unable to meet anyone's gaze. This can't be true, Matt muttered, looking from me to Jason. You wouldn't do that, right? Jason opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was trapped. Everyone was watching him now, waiting for him to deny it, but he couldn't. The truth hung heavy in the air. I trusted you, I said quietly, my voice thick with anger and disgust. Both of you. The room was silent again, the weight of betrayal sinking in. The friends we had shared for years were now looking at Jason and Amelia with the same disgust I felt. The judgment in their eyes was clear. One by one they began to stand up, shaking their heads in disbelief. No one wanted to stay any longer. Matt and Lisa were the first to leave, followed quickly by Kate and her husband. No one said goodbye to Jason or Amelia. The door closed behind them and suddenly the house felt empty. Jason stood there, looking lost, as if everything he had just lost hadn't fully registered yet. Amelia sat motionless, tears silently running down her face. I stood at the head of the table, watching them both, feeling a cold sense of satisfaction. Their world had just fallen apart. The house was eerily silent after the last guest left. Jason stood there, pale and broken, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of what had just happened was too much for him to bear. Amelia was still seated at the dining table, her head hung low, staring blankly at the remains of the dinner that no one had touched. The air felt heavy, like the final breath after a storm, and I savored the emptiness it left behind. I stood there for a few moments longer, taking in the scene. This was what I had wanted. Their destruction. The unraveling of their lies. It had gone exactly as planned, yet I felt no relief. No sense of victory, just a hollow, lingering numbness. Jason finally spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. Neil, I'm sorry. I turned to face him, my expression cold. Sorry? I spat the word back at him, incredulous. You're sorry now? After months of lying, sneaking around with my wife and stabbing me in the back, now you're sorry? He flinched at my words, his eyes downcast, unable to meet my gaze. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. I don't know what I was thinking. You weren't thinking, I snapped. Neither of you were. You were just selfish. You wanted what wasn't yours and you didn't care who you hurt to get it. Amelia let out a sob, covering her face with her hands. I ignored her. I wasn't interested in her tears. They didn't mean anything now, not after everything she had done. Jason took a step toward me, desperation in his eyes. Please, Neil, I know I messed up, but we've been friends for years. Can't we talk about this? Work something out? I laughed bitterly. Work something out? Do you think we can just talk our way through this? That we can go back to the way things were? I shook my head, my voice full of contempt. You don't get it, do you? There's no coming back from this. You ruined everything. You ruined my marriage and our friendship. Hell, you even destroyed your own reputation. And for what? For a few months of sneaking around? Jason opened his mouth to speak, but I didn't give him the chance. Get out, I said, my voice cold and final. Get out of my house. He hesitated for a moment as if he was going to argue, but then he saw the look in my eyes. Without another word, he turned and walked out the door, his footsteps heavy, like a man carrying the weight of his own mistakes. Amelia remained at the table, quietly sobbing. I could feel her presence behind me, but I didn't turn to face her. She was as much a stranger to me now as Jason was. You should leave too, I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. Neil, please, can we just talk? I know I hurt you, but we can still fix this. We can. There's nothing left to fix, I interrupted. You made your choice. Now live with it. She sat there for a moment, her lips trembling as if she wanted to say something more. But she didn't. She stood up slowly, as if the weight of her guilt was pressing down on her, and silently left the room. I heard her footsteps as she walked upstairs, the soft creak of the floorboards echoing through the empty house. I stayed in the dining room for a long time after that, staring at the wreckage of the evening. Plates of untouched food, wine glasses with barely a sip taken, chairs pushed back in haste as everyone had left. It felt like a war zone after the battle was over. But there was no victory here, just ashes. The days that followed were a blur. Amelia stayed in the house, but we barely spoke. She slept in the guest room, and our paths rarely crossed. The house felt cold and lifeless. The silence that had once been comforting now weighed on me like a suffocating blanket. It wasn't just the silence between us, it was the silence of everything we had once been. She didn't try to apologize again, and I didn't ask for any explanation. There was no point. The damage was done. There was no undoing it, no going back to the way things were. We had both become ghosts haunting the same space. Word of what had happened spread quickly. By Monday the phone call started. Matt was the first to reach out. He wanted to check on me, to see how I was holding up. I told him I was fine, but I knew he didn't believe me. I wasn't fine. I was barely functioning, but I couldn't let anyone see that. Over the next few days, more of our friends called, some to offer their support, some out of morbid curiosity. No one called Jason. He had become a pariah overnight, the fallout of my public revelation isolating him completely. I had taken everything from him just like I had planned. Amelia too was shunned. No one in our circle wanted anything to do with her. Kate, who had been her closest friend, cut her off completely. It was as if Amelia and Jason had become invisible to the world overnight. Exactly as I had intended. But the strangest part? The more isolated they became, the more isolated I felt. It didn't make sense. I had won. I had taken everything from them and destroyed their reputations, their relationships, their lives. But instead of feeling satisfied, I felt hollow. One evening I came home to find Amelia sitting in the living room, staring at the wedding photo we had taken years ago. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes hollow, dark circles under them. "I'm leaving," she said quietly. I paused, taken off guard. I had expected her to stay, to try to salvage what was left, but her voice had a finality to it. "When?" "Tomorrow," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found a place to stay for a while. I need to go. We can't keep living like this." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. In some strange way, I had been waiting for this. It was the only logical conclusion. She stood up slowly, brushing past me as she walked toward the stairs, her presence like a shadow that I could barely feel anymore. That night, I sat in the empty living room, staring at that same wedding photo. The smiles on our faces seemed like they belonged to different people, people who no longer existed. I had wanted this. I had wanted to destroy everything, and I had succeeded. But as I sat there, alone in the house that no longer felt like home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had destroyed a part of myself along with them. The day Amelia left, the house felt heavier than ever. She packed her things silently, avoiding my gaze as if we had become strangers who shared nothing but bad memories. I didn't help her. I just watched from a distance, leaning against the doorway of the guest room as she folded clothes into a suitcase. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as if every piece of fabric was weighted with the history we had built together, only for it to unravel in the most brutal way. When she finally zipped up the suitcase, she stood up and looked at me. Her eyes were bloodshot, her face pale and tired. I hadn't seen her like that before, so small, so broken. But there was no pity left in me. "I don't know how we got here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I'm sorry for everything. I'm leaving because it's what's best for both of us. We can't keep hurting each other." I nodded, offering no response. Her apology hung in the air between us like a cloud, but it didn't sink in. It couldn't. I had built a wall too thick, too high, and nothing she said could breach it. She grabbed her suitcase and walked toward the door. "I'll be staying with my sister for a while," she added, her voice trembling as she spoke. "If you need anything, I guess you know where to find me." I didn't respond. I just watched her walk out of the door, her figure disappearing down the hallway until I heard the front door close behind her. The silence that followed was deafening, but this time it didn't feel victorious. It felt final. I stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet. I had wanted this, her gone, out of my life, her betrayal punished. But now that she was really gone, the hollow feeling I had been carrying for weeks had deepened. I was standing in the wreckage of everything I thought I wanted, but instead of satisfaction, all I felt was emptiness. Jason hadn't called. No surprise there. After the dinner party, his name had become synonymous with betrayal, and he was shunned from our entire social circle. I knew he was living in the wreckage too, but I didn't care about what he was going through. I had gotten what I wanted. He was alone, friendless, cast out just like I had planned. But now, standing in this empty house, I started to wonder if it had been worth it. I had destroyed his life and Amelia's, but in doing so I had obliterated my own. Friends who once called to check on me had stopped. The sympathy had dried up, replaced by awkward silences and changed subjects whenever I walked into a room. They had been entertained by the drama at first, but now they didn't know what to do with the aftermath. I tried to go back to work, to focus on something else, but even there I couldn't escape the whispers. People talked, they always talked, and my story had spread through the office like wildfire. I became that guy, the man who had exposed his wife's affair in front of all their friends. Some people thought I was brave, others thought I was ruthless, but no one really knew what it was like to live in the fallout. On Friday, Matt called. His voice was tentative, like he wasn't sure if he should even be talking to me. "Hey man, how are you holding up?" "Fine," I lied, "just getting through it." "Yeah, I figured." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Listen, a few of us were talking and we're getting together tomorrow night. Just, to hang out. Thought you might want to come." I knew what this was. An olive branch. A chance to return to normalcy, to pretend like everything hadn't fallen apart. But the truth was, I wasn't ready. I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready. "I appreciate it, Matt," I said, forcing a smile even though he couldn't see me. "But I think I'm going to sit this one out. Got some stuff to take care of around the house." There was another pause, and I could hear the hesitation in his voice. "Yeah, I get it. Well, if you change your mind, you know where to find us." "Thanks," I muttered, hanging up before he could say anything else. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to face them all again, not after everything that had happened. The party had burned too many bridges and I wasn't ready to rebuild them. The next day passed in a blur. I wandered through the house, cleaning up rooms that didn't need to be cleaned, and organizing drawers that hadn't been touched in months. Anything to keep my mind busy. But it wasn't enough. The thoughts still crept in, uninvited. In the late afternoon, I found myself in the bedroom, standing in front of the closet that Amelia had once filled with her clothes. It was empty now, just a few hangers swaying lightly from the bar. I stared at them, feeling a strange sense of loss. It wasn't that I missed her, not really. It was the life we had built, the one I thought was real, that was gone. I had spent so much time focusing on revenge that I hadn't stopped to think about what came after. What was I supposed to do now? I sat down on the edge of the bed, running my hands through my hair. The room felt too big, too quiet. The life I had meticulously planned out had vanished in the space of a few months, and now I didn't know who I was without it. I thought back to that moment in the bedroom when I had first discovered Amelia and Jason together. The shock, the rage, the betrayal, all of it had been so consuming that it had felt like the only thing I could do was destroy them. And I had. But in the process, I had destroyed myself too. Now, all that was left was the question that I couldn't escape: what was I supposed to do with the ruins? As night fell, I went downstairs and poured myself a drink. I stood at the window, looking out at the quiet street. The darkness outside mirrored the darkness I felt inside. I had gotten everything I wanted, and yet, I had never felt more lost. The truth hit me then, with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. Revenge doesn't fix anything. It doesn't heal the wound. It just leaves you standing in the ashes, wondering what's next. And for the first time since this all began, I realized I had no idea what that would be. The days bled into each other after Amelia left. I'd wake up in the morning and go through the motions: shower, breakfast, work, return home to an empty house, but each day felt more meaningless than the last. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful. It had become oppressive, like a constant reminder of what I'd lost, what I had destroyed. At first I thought it was just a phase, that maybe I was going through the natural process of letting go. But the more time passed, the more I realized that the emptiness wasn't temporary. It was permanent, and I had no one to blame for it but myself. The friends I still had kept their distance, and I didn't blame them. I had put on a show of revenge, publicly shaming Amelia and Jason. At the time it felt necessary, like it was the only way I could regain control of a life that had spiraled out of my grasp. But now, the fallout of my actions lingered in every interaction. People were uncomfortable around me, unsure of how to act. I'd catch their glances at work, their whispered conversations when they thought I wasn't listening. They didn't know what to say, or how to engage with the man who had turned his private heartbreak into a public spectacle. And the truth was, I didn't know how to engage with them either. One evening, after another long, tedious day at work, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the coffee table. The TV was on, but I wasn't watching it. I was just staring into space, letting the numbness wash over me. The doorbell rang, breaking the heavy quiet of the house. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I considered ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me, so I dragged myself off the couch and went to the door. When I opened it, I was surprised to see Kate standing there. She looked uncomfortable, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, her eyes scanning the house as if she didn't really want to be there. "Hey Neil," she said awkwardly, stuffing her hands into her pockets. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside, wordlessly gesturing for her to enter. Kate had been Amelia's best friend, one of the people I thought I had driven away forever after that disastrous dinner party. Seeing her on my doorstep felt strange, like a piece of the past I had buried was suddenly back in front of me. She walked into the living room, glancing at the whiskey bottle and the empty glass on the table. I could tell she was trying to figure out what to say and how to start the conversation. Finally, she let out a sigh and turned to face me. "I've been meaning to come by," she said, her voice quiet. "I just didn't know what to say after everything that happened." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. I wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but I knew it wasn't going to be easy. Kate sat down on the edge of the couch, her fingers nervously picking at a thread on her sleeve. Look, Neil, I know we haven't talked since that night. But I've been thinking about it a lot. About you, about Amelia, about everything. And I cut her off, my voice harsher than I intended. What is there to talk about, Kate? You saw what happened. You were there. Amelia cheated on me, Jason betrayed me, and now they're both gone. End of story. Kate flinched at my tone, but she didn't back down. That's not the end of the story, Neil. Do you think because you exposed them they're out of your life now that everything's over? It's not that simple. I sat down across from her, rubbing my temples as a headache started to form. What do you want me to say? That I regret what I did? That I should have handled it differently? I don't know anymore, Kate. She looked at me, her expression softening. I'm not saying you shouldn't be angry. What they did was horrible. But Neil, you didn't just destroy their lives, you destroyed your own too. Her words hit harder than I expected because deep down I knew she was right. I had been so focused on getting revenge, on making sure Amelia and Jason paid for what they did, that I hadn't realized the toll it had taken on me. I had isolated myself and pushed away the people who cared about me, and now I was left with nothing. I don't know how to come back from this, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I thought getting revenge would make me feel better, but all it's done is make me feel more alone. Kate sighed, leaning forward slightly. Revenge never heals anything, Neil. It just leaves you with more damage. You wanted justice, and I get that, but you can't live the rest of your life stuck in this cycle of anger and hurt. At some point you have to figure out how to move on. I looked at her, the weight of her words settling in. Move on? I didn't even know what that looked like anymore. I had spent so long planning my revenge, fueling myself with rage, that the idea of living without it felt foreign. How? I asked, my voice cracking with exhaustion. How do I even start? Kate gave me a small, sad smile. I don't know. But maybe you start by forgiving yourself, for what happened, for what you did. And then maybe you start forgiving them, not for their sake but for yours. Her words lingered in the air, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something other than anger. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. A flicker of something softer. I sat back, staring at the whiskey glass in front of me, trying to wrap my mind around the idea of forgiveness. I wasn't sure if I was ready, or if I would ever be. But as Kate sat there in the silence offering me the smallest hint of hope, I realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop living in the ruins and start figuring out how to rebuild. Because if I didn't, this empty house and my hollow victory would be all I'd ever have left. The conversation with Kate lingered in my mind for days after she left. Her words echoed in the silence of the house, especially the idea of forgiving myself. That thought gnawed at me because I wasn't sure I even knew what that meant anymore. How could I forgive myself for turning my entire life into a battleground? How could I forgive Amelia and Jason when their betrayal still felt fresh in my veins? But Kate was right about one thing. I couldn't keep living like this. The anger, the isolation, it was eating me alive. The revenge I had poured my soul into had left nothing but wreckage, and now I was standing in the ruins without a map of how to move forward. I spent the next few days avoiding people. I ignored Matt's calls and texts from the few friends who still reached out. I wasn't ready to face them yet. Instead, I threw myself into work, spending long hours at the office just to avoid the empty house waiting for me each night. One evening I came home late, the sky already darkening as I unlocked the door. The house was quiet as usual, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't suffocating or oppressive, it was just there. I walked into the living room and sat down on the couch, staring at the wedding photo that still hung on the wall. Amelia's smile in the photo was so genuine, so real. I hadn't looked at it in weeks, avoiding it like a wound that hadn't yet healed. But now as I looked at it, something inside me shifted. I didn't feel the usual wave of anger. Instead, there was a kind of sadness, a grief for the life I had lost. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the contacts, stopping when I reached Amelia's name. My thumb hovered over the screen. I hadn't spoken to her since the night she left. Part of me had wanted it that way, but now, I wasn't sure anymore. I felt a pull, something telling me that maybe after all this time, I needed to confront the mess we had made. Before I could second-guess myself, I tapped her name and called. The ringing seemed to last forever, and just when I thought it was going to go to voicemail, she picked up. Neil? Her voice was soft, hesitant. I hadn't planned what to say. I hadn't even expected her to answer. Hey, Amelia, I finally managed, my voice sounding foreign at the moment. I wanted to tea-talk. There was a long pause on the other end, and I could hear her breathing as if she was trying to decide whether to hang up or stay on the line. About what? She asked, her tone cautious. About everything, I said, exhaling deeply. I don't know where to start, but I think we need to have a real conversation. For both of us. She didn't say anything for a while, and I thought maybe she wasn't ready. But then to my surprise she agreed. "Okay," she said quietly. "I think we should talk too." We made plans to meet the next evening. When I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: hope. It was faint, but it was there. The next day I met her at a small cafe. It was neutral ground, a place neither of us had any connection to, and it felt safe in that way. When I walked in, Amelia was already sitting at a table by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She looked up when I approached, her expression guarded but not hostile. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi," I replied, sitting down across from her. For a moment we just sat there in silence, neither of us knowing how to start. But then I spoke, my voice low and uncertain. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about what we did to each other." Amelia looked down at her cup, nodding slightly. "Me too. I've been thinking about it every day." "I'm not here to rehash everything," I said, my hands clasped together on the table. I need to understand. Why? Why did you do it?" She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting mine for the first time. "I don't know if I can give you a simple answer, Neil. I was lost. Our marriage, it wasn't working, and I didn't know how to fix it. Jason was. He was a mistake, a horrible, awful mistake, but at the time I thought I needed someone to fill the emptiness I felt." Her words stung, but I listened. I had asked for the truth, and this was it, raw and painful. "And you couldn't talk to me?" I asked, my voice tight with emotion. "You couldn't tell me how you felt?" "I should have," she admitted. "I should have told you everything. But I was scared. Scared of what it would mean, scared of losing you, and in the end, I lost you anyway." We sat in silence after that, both of us processing the weight of what had been said. Finally I nodded, my throat tight. "I was angry. Still am, if I'm honest. But I've been thinking about what I did too. About the way I handled things after I found out." Amelia looked at me, her eyes full of sadness. "You wanted revenge." "I did," I admitted. "I wanted to hurt you, and I wanted to hurt Jason. And I did. But it didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made everything worse." She nodded slowly. "I know. I felt it too. The shame, the regret, it hasn't gone away." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of months of anger, grief, and confusion start to lift, even if just a little. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you," I said honestly, "but I think I can try to move on." Amelia's eyes welled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "I don't expect your forgiveness, Neil, but I'm glad you're willing to try." We talked for a long time that evening. It wasn't easy, and it didn't fix everything, but it was a start. For the first time we were honest with each other, acknowledging the mess we had made and the pain we had caused. There were no promises, no declarations of forgiveness or closure. But when we parted ways I felt lighter, like I had taken the first step towards something I couldn't yet name. After talking to Amelia, I knew the next conversation I had to have wouldn't be as simple. Facing Jason wasn't something I looked forward to, but it was necessary. I couldn't avoid him forever. The anger still simmered beneath the surface, but I needed to confront it, to confront him if I was ever going to truly move forward. I reached out to him the following week. The phone call was brief, awkward, and filled with long pauses and hesitant words. He agreed to meet, though I could tell he was nervous. I didn't blame him. The last time we had spoken had been the night of the dinner party, when I had destroyed his reputation in front of everyone we knew. We met at a bar on the edge of town, far from the places we used to go together. Jason arrived before I did, sitting in a booth in the corner, his eyes downcast as he fiddled with a coaster. When I sat down across from him, he looked up, his face pale and tense. "Neil," he said quietly. "Jason," I responded, my voice stiff. We ordered drinks, and the silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Jason shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, but he didn't say anything at first. Finally, I broke the silence. "I don't even know where to start with you." He winced, running a hand through his hair. "I know. And I don't know what to say, man. I've been thinking about this for months, about how badly I screwed up." "You didn't just screw up," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "You betrayed me. You were my best friend and you slept with my wife. You lied to me over and over." Jason's face flushed with guilt. "I know, and I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I deserve it." I leaned back in my seat, letting his words hang in the air. The anger still burned, but it wasn't as intense as it had been before. "You don't," I said flatly, "but I'm not here for that." He looked up at me, confused. "Then why are you here?" "Because I need to move on," I said, my voice steady. "I need to let go of this anger, and I can't do that if I don't face you. What you did was unforgivable, but carrying this around with me, it's eating me alive." Jason nodded slowly, his eyes full of remorse. "I never wanted to hurt you. I wish I could take it all back. But you can't," I said, cutting him off. "Neither of us can. The only thing we can do now is figure out how to live with it." We sat there in silence after that, both of us lost in our own thoughts. There was no closure, no neat ending to this conversation. But as I left the bar that night, I felt a small sense of release. Jason and I would never be friends again, but at least I had faced him. At least I had taken another step away from the anger that had consumed me for so long. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Weeks passed after my meetings with Amelia and Jason. Life didn't instantly transform. It wasn't some cinematic moment where everything fell into place, but something inside me had shifted. The weight of the anger I had carried for so long had lightened. There was still pain, still unresolved feelings, but it was no longer all-consuming. I began to reconnect with the people I had pushed away. It wasn't easy. Many of them were hesitant, unsure if I was the same Neil they once knew or the version of me who had dragged them into my personal vendetta. But gradually I started attending small gatherings again, trying to rebuild the bridges I had burned. One night, I found myself at Matt's house for a barbecue. It was the first real social event I'd been to since the fallout. The smell of grilled meat filled the air, and laughter drifted across the yard as people mingled, catching up with each other. It was strange being around friends again, knowing they had all witnessed the spectacle I'd created, but I was determined to move forward. As I stood by the grill, watching Matt flip burgers, he glanced at me. "You okay, man?" he asked, his voice low so the others wouldn't overhear. I nodded, though the truth was more complicated than that. "Getting there," I said, trying to offer a reassuring smile. "It's been a lot," Matt nodded, flipping another burger. "Yeah, I figured. Look, I'm glad you're here. I know it's been rough, but it's good to see you trying to get back to normal." Normal. That word hit me in a way I hadn't expected. What did normal even mean now? My life was nothing like it had been before, and I wasn't sure if it ever would be again. But maybe that was okay. Maybe normal wasn't something I had to chase. Maybe it was something I had to redefine. "I appreciate that," I said, taking a sip of my drink. "I'm trying to make things right, or at least better." Matt gave me a knowing look, but he didn't press further. Instead, he handed me a plate of burgers and motioned for me to take them to the group. As I walked across the yard, I realized that this was the first time in months that I didn't feel completely out of place. I wasn't fully healed, but I wasn't lost anymore either. As the evening went on, I found myself relaxing, laughing at jokes, and even joining in on conversations. It felt good, almost natural, to be part of a group again. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed it until that moment. Later, as I sat by the fire pit staring into the flames, Kate took a seat next to me. She hadn't spoken much to me that night, but now, as we sat in the warm glow of the fire, she turned to me with a small smile. "You look better," she said softly, her eyes reflecting the flickering light. "Less angry." I chuckled, though it wasn't a full laugh. "Yeah, I guess I am. I've had some time to think, to deal with things." Kate nodded, pulling her knees up to her chest. "I'm glad to hear that. You've come a long way since everything." There was a brief pause before I spoke again. "Thanks for what you said that night. About forgiveness, about moving on. I didn't want to hear it then, but I needed it." "I know," she said, smiling softly. "And I'm glad you listened. You deserve a life that isn't just defined by what happened." As we sat there in comfortable silence, I realized that this was part of my new normal. Finding moments of peace, of connection, and letting go of the past bit by bit. The real test came a month later when I heard through mutual friends that Amelia and Jason were leaving town. They hadn't stayed together, unsurprising given the circumstances, but both of them had decided to move away, separately. The news hit me with a strange mix of relief and something I couldn't quite define. It felt like the final chapter was closing. With them gone, there would be no chance of running into either of them. No awkward moments at social gatherings. No lingering reminders of the betrayal. In a way, it was what I had wanted all along, a clean break. But now that it was actually happening, I found myself conflicted. Their departure meant that everything I had been holding on to, the anger, the betrayal, the need for revenge, was leaving with them. I was being forced to confront what my life would look like without the pain as my constant companion. I decided to reach out to Amelia one last time. I didn't know why. Maybe it was for closure. Maybe it was just to say goodbye. I texted her, asking if we could meet before she left. To my surprise, she agreed. We met at the same cafe where we'd had our first conversation after the fallout. It was quieter this time, fewer people around, and Amelia looked more at peace than she had the last time we spoke. There was a sense of finality in the air, like we both knew this was the last time we would see each other for a long time. "Thanks for meeting me," I said as I sat down across from her. She nodded, her expression soft but reserved. "I figured we should have one last conversation, clear the air." "Yeah," I agreed, taking a deep breath. "I heard you're leaving." "I am," she confirmed. "I need a fresh start." "I think we both do." I nodded slowly, feeling the truth of her words. I wanted to say that I'm trying to let go of all of it, the anger, the resentment. It's not easy, but I'm working on it. Amelia looked down at her cup of tea, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I'm glad to hear that, Neil. I've been trying too. What happened between us? It'll always be a part of our past, but it doesn't have to define our futures." Her words hit me in a way I hadn't expected. For so long, I had clung to the idea that the betrayal had ruined everything, that it had destroyed me. But maybe it didn't have to. Maybe I could take what happened and learn from it instead of letting it consume me. I think you're right, I said quietly. I don't know what the future looks like for either of us, but I hope we both find some peace. Amelia nodded, her eyes softening. I hope so too. There was nothing left to say after that. We sat in silence for a while, letting the weight of our past hang between us for the last time. When we finally said our goodbyes, it felt final, like the door was closing on that chapter of our lives, and we were both ready to walk through the next one. As I walked away from the cafe, I felt lighter. The ghosts of what had happened would always be with me, but they didn't have to haunt me anymore. I could carry them with me without letting them define me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was ready to move forward. Maybe, just maybe, I was finally free. Months passed after Amelia left town, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of clarity. The constant churn of anger, betrayal, and regret that had defined my days had finally started to quiet. The rawness of it all had dulled, leaving room for something new to take root, a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. Life didn't magically transform, but it took on a different rhythm. I began focusing on things that had once brought me joy but that I had lost sight of in the chaos. I started going for runs again, pushing my body in the way I used to before everything fell apart. The physical release was grounding, a reminder that I still had control over some aspects of my life. I also began reconnecting with old friends, not just the ones who had stuck by me, but those I had pushed away when I was at my worst. Some were hesitant, unsure if the man standing in front of them was the same friend they had known before, but others welcomed me back with open arms. There were awkward conversations and apologies on both sides, but the important thing was that the doors I had slammed shut were slowly opening again. One evening, after a long day at work, I found myself sitting on my balcony watching the sunset. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, and a cool breeze rustled the trees below. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions I had been consumed by for so long. As I sat there, sipping a beer, I realized that for the first time in months I wasn't obsessing over what had happened. I wasn't replaying the betrayal in my head or plotting some sort of emotional revenge. I was just existing. It was then that I realized how much I had missed out on by letting my anger control me. There had been entire moments, entire days, weeks, months, that I had lost to bitterness and resentment. But now, those days were behind me, and I had a choice. I could continue letting the past dictate my present, or I could reclaim my life piece by piece. As I sat there, my phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Kate, asking if I wanted to meet up for a drink later that week. Kate and I had grown closer in the months since Amelia and Jason had left. She had been there for me through some of my darkest moments, and now, our friendship felt like one of the few stable things in my life. I smiled at the message and quickly replied that I'd love to meet. Kate wasn't the only friend I had reconnected with, but she was the one who had seen the mess I had become and had still stuck around. We had developed a kind of easy camaraderie, and though I didn't know where it might lead, I was grateful for it. Later that week, we met at a small bar on the edge of town, the same place where I had confronted Jason. This time, though, the atmosphere felt entirely different. The weight of that confrontation had long since lifted, and now the bar was just a bar. No ghosts, no lingering resentment. Kate greeted me with a smile as I walked in, her eyes sparkling in the dim light. We grabbed a booth near the back, ordered drinks, and settled into our usual banter. There was something comforting about being with her, a sense of familiarity that didn't carry the baggage of my past relationships. As the night wore on, we talked about everything: work, life, and even some of the darker moments we had both gone through. There was no pretense between us, no need to hide the messier parts of ourselves. We had seen each other at our worst, and yet, here we were, laughing over drinks, sharing stories as if nothing had ever changed. At some point, the conversation turned to Amelia and Jason. It was inevitable given how much they had defined the last year of my life. But this time, when Kate asked how I was feeling about it all, I found myself shrugging. I don't know, I said, staring down at my drink. It feels like it's finally in the past. I'm not angry anymore, not really. It just is what it is. Kate smiled, nodding. That's progress. You've come a long way. Yeah, I guess I have, I replied, realizing just how true that was. The man sitting here tonight wasn't the same man who had set out to destroy two people's lives. I wasn't perfect, but I was healing. As we left the bar that night, walking out into the cool evening air, I felt lighter than I had in a long time. Kate and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, saying our goodbyes, and as I watched her walk away, I realized something else. I had a future again. For so long I had been stuck in the past, letting it dictate every decision I made. But now, for the first time in what felt like forever, I was excited about what came next. I didn't know where my life would take me, whether Kate would be part of that journey or not, but the possibilities stretched out before me, vast and open. I walked home that night with a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The darkness that had once clouded my every thought was lifting, and in its place was something brighter, something filled with potential. It wasn't about forgiveness or forgetting, it was about letting go of the pain, the anger, the need for revenge. Letting go of the idea that my life had been ruined by what had happened. I had a life to reclaim, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready to start living it. A few weeks after that night at the bar with Kate, I received a message that caught me off guard. It was from Greg, one of the friends who had drifted away during the chaos of Amelia and Jason's affair. We hadn't spoken in months, not since I had exposed their infidelity and blown up our entire social circle. I figured most of those relationships were beyond repair, but here Greg was, sending me an unexpected invitation. He was hosting a small gathering at his house, a backyard barbecue, nothing fancy. The invite felt casual, but there was an unspoken weight behind it. It was as if Greg was extending a branch, giving me an opportunity to step back into a world I had once belonged to but had destroyed in my quest for revenge. I stared at the message for a while, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to decline, to avoid the awkwardness of facing people who had seen me at my worst. But another part of me knew that if I didn't go, I'd be cementing the isolation I had created for myself. This was a chance to rebuild, to move forward, and I couldn't let fear hold me back. After a moment I typed out a response. Thanks for the invite, I'll be there. The day of the barbecue arrived, and as I got ready to leave, I found myself feeling more nervous than I had expected. I wasn't the same person who had last stood among these friends, and I wasn't sure how they would react to my presence. Would they still see me as the man who had turned their world upside down? Or would they be willing to let me start fresh? When I arrived at Greg's house, the familiar sounds of laughter and conversation greeted me from the backyard. I paused at the gate for a moment, taking a deep breath before stepping through. The scene that met me was a flashback to the life I had once had. Friends gathered around, drinks in hand, chatting and joking as the smell of grilled food filled the air. It was as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. I spotted Greg near the grill, flipping burgers with a spatula, and he waved when he saw me. A few other people turned to look, their eyes lingering on me for a moment longer than felt comfortable. I could sense the tension in the air, but no one said anything. Greg motioned for me to come over, and I joined him by the grill, trying to shake off the unease. "Hey man," Greg said with a smile that felt genuine. "Glad you could make it." "Thanks for inviting me," I replied, trying to match his tone. "It's been a while." Greg nodded, flipping a burger onto a plate. "Yeah, it has. But it's good to see you back." The conversation started off slow as if we were both testing the waters, but soon enough we fell into an easy rhythm. We talked about work, about the sports season, about everything except the elephant in the room, my fallout with Amelia and Jason. I wasn't sure if Greg was avoiding the topic on purpose, but I was grateful for the reprieve. For now, it was enough to just be part of the group again. As the evening wore on, I began to relax. I reconnected with a few others, exchanged stories, and even found myself laughing at a few old jokes. There was still an underlying tension, but it wasn't as suffocating as I had feared. It seemed that people were willing to give me a chance, even if things weren't exactly the way they used to be. At one point I found myself standing with Kate, who had arrived a bit later. She gave me a knowing smile as we watched Greg and some of the others goof around by the fire pit. "So," she said, nudging me playfully, "how's it feel to be back in the fold?" I shrugged, though I couldn't hide the small smile tugging at my lips. "Weird, but good. Better than I expected." Kate nodded, her eyes flickering over to the group. "They're not holding any grudges, you know. People get it. You were going through a lot." I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. "I still feel like I owe them an apology for dragging everyone into that mess." "You don't need to apologize anymore," Kate said softly. "You've already done that. The fact that you're here, trying to move forward, that's what matters." Her words sank in, and I realized she was right. The past was behind us. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could control how I moved forward from it. I could rebuild, step by step. Later in the evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the fire pit became the centerpiece of the gathering, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Greg, a beer in hand, grinning as he handed me one too. "I've got to say, Neil," he began, raising his bottle in a small toast, "I wasn't sure if you'd come tonight, but I'm glad you did." I clinked my bottle against him, feeling a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the alcohol. I wasn't sure either, but I think I needed this. Greg nodded, taking a sip of his drink. "It's good to have you back, man. We all go through shit, but what matters is that you came out the other side." I looked around the group, at the faces that had once been part of my everyday life, and who were now letting me back in. The wounds weren't fully healed, and things might never go back to the way they were. But standing there, surrounded by old friends, I realized that maybe that was okay. Maybe I didn't need things to go back to the way they were. Maybe I just needed to find a new way forward, with the people who were willing to stick around. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to do just that. The weeks that followed Greg's barbecue felt like a slow but steady return to normalcy, though normal was something I had begun to redefine. There was a rhythm to my life again, a calmness that had been absent for far too long. The anger and chaos that had consumed me were finally starting to fade, leaving space for something new, hope, maybe, or at least acceptance. I was sitting on my balcony one Saturday morning, sipping coffee and enjoying the quiet, when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and saw a message from Kate. "Brunch at the diner?" A smile crept across my face as I typed a quick reply. "I'll be there." Kate and I had grown closer in the months since the fallout with Amelia and Jason. She'd been my anchor through the darkest moments, and now, as things were starting to settle, our friendship felt like the most solid thing in my life. There was no rush to define it, just a shared understanding that we had both been through something and come out the other side together. When I arrived at the diner, Kate was already seated at a booth by the window, 2 mugs of coffee on the table. She smiled when she saw me, her eyes bright and welcoming. Sliding into the seat across from her, I felt a familiar sense of ease wash over me. This was a part of my life that had survived the storm. "How's it going?" she asked, handing me the menu even though we both knew I always ordered the same thing. "Good," I said, and for once I genuinely meant it. "Better, actually." She nodded, sipping her coffee. "I can tell you seem lighter." I chuckled, glancing out the window at the people passing by. "I feel lighter. I think I'm finally starting to let go." Kate smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "About time. You've been carrying that weight for a long while." She wasn't wrong. I had spent months, years really, letting my anger define me, letting the betrayal of Amelia and Jason consume every part of my life. But now, as I sat here, I realized that the grip it had on me was loosening. The wound would always be there, but it didn't hurt the same way anymore. It didn't control me. As we ate, our conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from work to plans for the upcoming summer. There were no heavy moments, no lingering shadows from the past. Just 2 friends, enjoying a lazy Saturday morning together. Toward the end of the meal, Kate set her fork down and leaned back in her seat, giving me a look I couldn't quite read. "So Neil," she began, a teasing smile tugging at the corner of her mouth, "what's next for you? You've spent all this time healing and getting your life back. What do you want to do now?" The question caught me off guard, but it was a good one. For so long I had been focused on surviving, on getting through each day without letting the past swallow me whole. But now that I was finally coming out the other side, I had to think about what I actually wanted from life. Not just what I was running from, but what I was running toward. "I'm not sure," I admitted, setting my coffee cup down. "But I think that's okay. I spent so long letting anger and revenge be my purpose. Maybe now it's time to figure out what I actually want." Kate raised an eyebrow, her smile widening. "That sounds like growth. I'm impressed." I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help laughing. "It's not exactly profound, but yeah, I guess it is." After brunch we walked through the town, the sun warm on our faces. The easy companionship between us was undeniable, but I still didn't feel the need to label it. Whatever we had was enough for now, and I was content with that. As we neared the park, we paused by a bench overlooking the pond. Kate sat down, motioning for me to join her. I did, and we sat in silence for a moment, watching the ducks glide across the water. "You know," Kate said after a while, her voice soft, "you're allowed to be happy again. You don't have to carry the guilt of what happened forever." I looked at her, surprised by the sudden seriousness in her tone. "I know," I said quietly, the weight of her words sinking in. "I think I'm finally starting to believe that." She smiled, leaning her head back against the bench. "Good. You deserve it, Neil. You deserve to move forward." As we sat there watching the world go by, I realized just how far I had come. The darkness that had once felt so suffocating was lifting, replaced by something lighter, something full of potential. I didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of it. In the end, life wasn't about the people who had hurt me or the betrayals I had endured. It was about what I chose to do next. And for the first time, I was ready to make that choice, to take control of my story instead of letting it be defined by someone else's actions. As Kate stood up, stretching her arms toward the sky, I followed suit, feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin. "So what's next?" she asked again, this time with a playful grin. I shrugged, smiling as I looked out at the pond. "Whatever comes, I guess, but this time I'm ready for it." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I knew that I meant it.